Hey there, YouTube. Welcome to Monday's edition of The Breakfast Club. I'm Got That Funk. Thanks for joining me. We are in round robin mode now on The Breakfast Club and will be for some time. If you're not familiar with how we do this sort of thing, I'll just sort of explain how it goes. We start off with one host who brings up a topic, and then each host in turn throughout the whole week will discuss different aspects of the same topic. The following week, the person who brought the topic up will do a rebuttal to all those responses, and then the next day, that host will bring up a brand new topic for discussion, and the whole group will discuss that, and so on and so on. Our newest host on The Breakfast Club is Sword Sage. He hosts Saturdays here in The Breakfast Club, and since he's new here, I thought it would be a good idea for him to be the first person to bring up a topic in the series for the round robin. And he brought up the situation with the media in America, talking a little bit about the problems with the broadcast media and posing questions as to, how can we fix these problems and so forth. I think it's a great topic, and I look forward to a lively and diverse discussion amongst the group. Now, obviously, most of you probably already know this. I'm an American citizen, but I do live abroad in the UK, and consequently, I don't really get exposed on a day-to-day basis with the US broadcast media. Obviously, I see little bits and snippets and so forth on the internet, but that is by no means proper consumption of the media. Not enough anyway to have a reasonable good opinion about certain aspects of the way the media works in America currently. I noticed that the not just the news media, but TV in general has changed so much since I left in the 80s. Now, I want to tell you a little story to preface the point I want to make at the end of this video. Back in 1938, Orson Welles hosted a radio play of an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds, in which invaders from Mars come to planet Earth to try and take over. And the format of the radio play is of a news broadcast, so it sounded very much like it was a broadcast of a real event. But they did have a disclaimer before the show started saying, obviously this is a show and it's fiction and it shouldn't be taken seriously. But then after that, for the first 40 minutes of the program, there was no more interruptions to remind people that they were listening to something that wasn't real. So anybody who missed the beginning or who just wasn't paying attention could be forgiven for thinking that it was a real broadcast talking about an invasion from Mars. And a result of the broadcast was, across the country, thousands of people panicked. And let's keep that in perspective, though. The United States, even in 1938, was a pretty populous country. There was over 100 million people. So when I say thousands of people across the country, keep that in perspective. I mean, we're not talking about a nationwide panic in the classical sense of the word, but we're just talking about a panic that happened from end to end of America in little pockets here and there, that kind of thing. And the panic was sufficient, though, to shut down phone lines in certain areas, and it basically sent the print media of the day into a frenzy about the repercussions of the radio broadcast. While the broadcast was happening, there's so many people panicking and calling the authorities that the actual police showed up at the studio trying to shut the broadcast down. And that was a whole separate sort of incident at the time. But I digress. The point I want to make about the War of the Worlds is the authorities sort of had their attention grabbed by this event because they came to realize in pretty quick fashion the power of the broadcast media, and that people could be led to believe something as preposterous as an alien invasion from outer space just because it came over the radio and they thought it was real. So the powers that be in Washington back in those days, and for a few years subsequent to 1938, brought in some regulations which did pertain in the USA for many decades and have only recently been repealed. For example, back in 1938, the reason that radio play was able to cause a national panic, or a nationwide panic I should say, is because in those days radio stations could broadcast simultaneously to the whole country. Whereas, as a result of the War of the Worlds broadcast, what used to be relay stations, where they would pick up the broadcast that was coming from the source, usually on the East Coast, and carrying it, further west, they became independent radio stations in their own right, and radio stations were diversified, and ownership of those stations was diversified as well. So even though there were still syndicates in terms of NBC, CBS, that kind of thing, who had affiliates who could then sort of pick up radio shows and pass them on, they usually didn't go out live simultaneously to the whole country. That was one regulatory aspect that happened as a result of War of the Worlds. Another one was that you couldn't own more than 2 radio stations or radio and TV stations in a single broadcast market. They wanted to have the largest possible plurality of owners, and the reason for that is that the more different owners that you have with broadcast media, the less concentration there will be of editorial content and of entertainment content for that matter as well. So it was obvious to them at that time that the fewer hands you concentrate ownership in, the more potential there is for that ownership power to be abused, because it will inevitably affect editorial decisions when it comes to news broadcasting and programming decisions as well. So I'm just going to use this as my example, because there's plenty of things that are wrong with the way the broadcast media works, not just in America but internationally. Sensationalism and the profit motive sort of come hand in hand, and I'm sure other hosts on the Breakfast Club will probably address those a bit more deeply than I'm going to. My main point is about the ownership of media. I think once upon a time, as a result of the War of the Worlds broadcast, foreign entities were not allowed to own broadcast media in America, and that went out the window during the deregulation days of the Ronald Reagan administration. So, and since Reagan, we've had more and more concentration of ownership, and as Sword Sage mentioned, basically 6 companies in America own well over 90% of all the broadcast media. And that is untenable. That level of concentration of ownership is not in anyone's interest. I'm just going to use one person as an example. That's Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is the owner of News Corporation. And News Corporation owns things like the Wall Street Journal, and I think the New York Times, and a plethora, the TV Guide, and the Racing Guide, and all kinds of media, stuff you wouldn't predict. Not all of it news media, lots of magazines and so forth. And of course, he owns TV broadcasting as well. He owns Fox News. He owns 20th Century Fox, the Hollywood studio. It's in his interests for the news to be sensationalized. It's in his interests to increase circulation of his print media as much as possible, and to get as many eyes on his channels and his broadcast networks as possible. Therefore, it's in his interest to stir up hatred and resentment of immigrants, because it sells. It's in his interests for countries to go to war, because it sells. Think about this. If reporting on war increases consumption of broadcast media and print media by even 5%, every single day, that makes him millions and millions of extra dollars than he might otherwise expect if there was no war or if there was no hype about immigration. This is why I don't take things like media hype very seriously, because I really just see it as vehicles to try to fool us into thinking that problems are bigger than that they are, just for the sake of increasing consumption of news media. Ownership is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that we have to face if we're going to fix the other smaller problems to do with the way the media functions and reports news in the United States and elsewhere. Because if we don't break up ownership, any other changes are just window dressing. That's my opinion. I look forward to a lively discussion in the comments section, and I'm also looking forward to seeing what the rest of the hosts on the Breakfast Club bring to the table. I'll be here again next week to discuss whatever topic Joe brings up. And until then, I want to thank you for watching. May all your ups and downs be ups.